No mai, harimai, kite o tako, whakaihu waka. Welcome to the Carle Distinguished Lecture Series here at the University of Otago. I'm Lisa Ellis, as most of you already know, from the philosophy program. And again, it is my happy duty to reintroduce Associate Professor Ben McKean of The Ohio State University to give us this fourth of the de Carle lectures. Speaking of this being the fourth lecture, we have now posted the 3 recordings interspersed with the slides thanks to our excellent technical support. They're really easy to find. If you Google YouTube Otago de Carle, they come right up, 1, 2, 3. So they are there for your delectation. And after those last 3, I am super stoked to hear today about whether calling climate change a global problem erases indigenous politics. Nore ra tena koto katoa. Please help me welcome Ben to the podium.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for the introduction, again, for having me to the philosophy program, to the de Carle Endowment, for hosting me, and for these lectures on climate change politics from despair to solidarity. Can everyone hear me all right? Is the sound okay for folks in the room? Great. So today, we're sort of maybe making a transition from the despair part to the solidarity part. At least the solidarity part is coming, I think, hopefully a little bit more into view for folks who've been following the whole series. So I'll be talking about this question, does calling climate change a global problem erase indigenous politics? To do that, I'm going to be drawing directly on some of the themes I developed in the previous lecture to help explain why we might care about this problem, how this problem might come up. So I'm going to be talking again, as I did last time, about who is the agent of social transformation. How are we going to know who is going to address the problem of climate change? And so I'm going to then turn to a perhaps surprising answer offered by Andreas Malm, the climate theorist and advocate, because he's going to suggest that it is a global subject. It is a sort of self-conscious global subject that we will all participate in, which is a sort of surprisingly idealist or abstract answer, given that what we might expect from someone who is advocating for us to blow up pipelines. So I'm going to reflect on that answer and try and clarify, well, what is a global subject? Why would a global subject be the kind of thing that we would need to address climate change? And to answer that question, I'm going to talk about the experience of domination today. I'm going to argue that a large part of why we need the idea of a global subject is to resist the forces that are trying to divide us today. And the way that that division happens is going to be important for understanding that. So that's going to be part of this part number 5, how a global subject can orient us. There's this question, a global subject doesn't currently exist, so how can it be useful to us? Right, and then finally, having done all that, having shown that there's some value in this idea of a global subject, I'm going to raise this, I think, very important challenge. Right? Does this idea of the global erase indigenous politics? Does the idea of the global subsume all these forms of difference? Does it cover over really important power differentials between, for example, the global north and the global south, between settler colonists and indigenous people? Or is there some way in which we can preserve our understanding of these important power differences even as we all join together in this global subject? So that's roughly the map for where we're going. So let me start again with this first question that I asked last week. Right. Who's going to solve climate change? Right? How are we going to address this massive problem? And I've argued that any plausible strategy for addressing the climate crisis needs to provide an account of how people can be organized into a political agent powerful enough to transform our global economic order. Right? Addressing climate change requires such a transformation. Who's going to do it? Now, the idea of having identifying the agent of social transformation might seem challenging, right? But I'm going to suggest that it's necessary for understanding the task in front of us, right? If we reject the idea of identifying an agent of social transformation, that means we would have to give up the idea that we can collectively, rationally, and intentionally change the way that we live together. And I'm not willing to give up on that idea yet, right? So if we're trying to figure out who's going to constitute a climate movement that's capable of winning, I think this is a question we need to answer. And as I mentioned last time, I think giving an account of the agent of social transformation to really understand what it would take for us to transform the global economy, how we're all going to participate in this together, right? We're going to need a few things. First, we need to understand who would constitute such an agent, who's going to belong to it, and how they're going to understand themselves, how they're going to understand their participation in it. Emotionally, affectively, what would move people to participate in constituting such an agent and to continue to identify with it? And finally, what political and organizational form such an agent should take? Right? What are the actual institutional connections that people are going to have? Not just how they imagine their connections with each other, but actually what's going to structure their relationships. Unfortunately, I don't think right now we have good answers to any of these three questions. And so what I'm going to try to develop, continue developing in this lecture is an answer to this first question about who would constitute such an agent. So in my last lecture, I talked about the idea of popular sovereignty and the idea that, well, maybe the people are going to be the agent of social transformation, right? And so there's a lot of different ways in which the people get invoked for climate change as the agent of kind of climate justice, the People's Summit for Climate Justice, and so on. Part of what I'm going to think about today is, well, what does it mean if the people isn't just the people of one country, but it's all of us, right? It's the people of the world. Is that something coherent as a political agent? Now, in the last lecture, I developed a couple different ways of thinking about the different kinds of things you might mean when you say the people are acting, right? There's two different kinds of power you might be attributing to the people in doing that, right? The first is this idea of popular sovereignty as a kind of unitary will, the idea that the people are taking back control. And that the people are going to have a will that persists in time. They're going to continue to control things. The other way that the people might express their power is through negation. They might refuse domination. They might refuse existing institutions, but without any claim about what follows from that. It's simply a negative claim that existing institutions are not an expression of the people's power. Then there are these other two dimensions that we need to think about, right? Who represents the people? Who speaks for the people? And how do they speak for the people? So I identified two different ways of claiming to speak for the people. One was a claim based in homogeneity, a logic that says, I represent the people because I'm like the people. And the other is a claim based on difference. It's a claim that says, I'm a particularly apt representative of the people because I've been marked as different in various ways. And so what I've tried to do in this previous lecture was to suggest that if we want to make claims on behalf of the people, the place where we can best find a political opening is through a combination of understanding the people's power as refusal, right, a negation of domination, and as a representative claim based on difference. Right? And if we bring those things together, that's where I think we can see the people beginning to we can develop an account of the people that could begin to address the climate crisis. So I ended the last lecture by putting this idea in a global context, right? By saying that if we stick to the people on the national level, just the people of one country, in order for them to really experience self-determination, in order for them to be a kind of political agent, we would already need to transform the global order. Right? As it stands, the global political and economic order undermines the ability of most countries to engage in self-determination. Right? Legacies of colonialism persist. Right? There's a brutally unequal economic order, even though there is formal legal equality. And so when countries have tried to exercise their own sovereignty in the interests of their people, in the interests of their working class, they've been repeatedly undermined by things like capital mobility and structural adjustment. So one of the examples that I put forward last time in thinking about what are some ways that the people could be the agent of social transformation to address the climate crisis was through making a demand for debt jubilee as a form of climate reparations. That many countries, many smaller countries, island nations, and others have taken on an enormous amount of debt, not through mostly no fault of their own, and bankers and international institutions are unwilling to relieve them of that debt. And so many of these countries, led by Barbados among others, has said, as a matter of climate justice, you need to forgive these debts. Right? And that's a kind of claim that I think is being made. It's a claim of popular sovereignty against existing institutions, to say that these institutions are dominating. And it's a claim based on difference. It says these institutions, right, climate adaptation and mitigation is in the interest of the whole world. It might look as though relieving this debt is not in the interests of rich countries, but in fact it is, and we can see that that's a kind of logic of representation based on difference. These small countries, what would be good for them would be good for everybody. The other claim that I ended with was the idea of the blockade that many indigenous people have led to stop pipelines through their territory. Right? And I connected this to the idea of the indigenous claims to get their land back from settler colonists. Right? So again, you can see this idea of taking action to stop pipelines is a form of popular sovereignty that's based in a refusal of existing institutions. And it's also a representative claim based on difference. It says indigenous people are facing particular threats, but helping them address those threats would be in everybody's interest. Right? So it's not saying that they are a good representative of the people of the world because they're like everybody else. They're saying the interests of these people are different, right? Their identity is different, but doing what's good for them will be good for everybody. So again, it's a kind of representative claim based on difference. So this is where I want to transition into the topic of today's lecture, about whether or not the idea of a global politics erases indigenous a global agent erases indigenous politics, right? Indigenous climate leadership has been very important to the climate movement, the climate justice movement, and I wanted to draw attention to two particular theorists. My own background is I'm most familiar with some of the indigenous climate movements in North America, so that's mostly what I'll be drawing on today. And I think, so Leanne Simpson, who's a member of the Mishi-Sagik-Nishnabek, says, indigenous peoples, in my mind, have more expertise in anti-capitalism and how that system works than any other group of people on the planet. Right? So she's making a claim to leadership here. They have the kind of knowledge that we need. And they also, she says, represent a different kind of relationship to land, which can be important to climate justice. She says, Aki, or land, is also liberation and freedom. My freedom to establish and maintain relations of deep reciprocity within a pristine homeland my ancestors handed down to me. And that idea of freedom being a relationship of reciprocity with the land is very different from the prevailing Western ideas of freedom as domination of the land, right? Freedom is the extraction of resources. So if we're looking for resources to conceive of climate justice, Simpson is putting forward some very important things, some offerings for us, right? Now, as Nick Estes, who's a member of the Lower Brule Sioux, reminds us, this is not to suggest that indigenous societies possess the solution to climate change, right? As he points out, many indigenous nations actively participate in resource extraction and capitalist economies in order to strengthen their self-determination. But in its best moments, the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline showed us a future that becomes possible when everyday Native people take control of their own destinies and lands while drawing upon their own traditions of resistance. So when I ask this question about erasing indigenous politics, I'm not suggesting that there's any one perspective that these groups offer, right? There's an enormous amount of argument within these politics, right? It's a politics after all. But I do think that making space for this kind of leadership is important. And if we identify an agent of social transformation to address climate change that tries to erase them, then we'd be doing something wrong, right? We'd be really shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think that's a live worry because, as I noted in my second lecture, there's a real tradition in the West of the idea of universal history erasing differences, right? The idea of saying, speaking for everybody, meaning that really you're speaking actually for a quite privileged group. And that's been true in global politics for a long time, and it's been true in political theory and political philosophy for a long time, where often talking about global justice has really meant asking the question, what should well-meaning rich people in the developed world do to help people in the developing world, thereby sort of erasing the agency and politics of the people in the developing world themselves. So it's very important as we develop an account of the agent of social transformation to not subsume or erase these important differences, right, including indigenous politics. So that's a little bit to preface the problem. Let me turn now to the account of a global subject and why I think it might be helpful. Right. So the question that I'm asking is, in a sense, in whose name should the transformation of global structures be undertaken? If we're going to transform the global economy, on whose authority are we doing it? Right? If we say the people, like, what do we mean? Why are they the ones who have the right to do this? Right? Well, if everybody's affected by climate change, right, is the people with the authority to do this all of us? Is it everybody? That's what Andreas Malm argues in his 2020 book, Corona Climate Chronic Emergency, reflecting on the connections between climate change, the climate crisis, and COVID-19. He says, zoonotic spillover of this earth-shattering magnitude should make it clear that defending wild nature against parasitic capital is now human self-defense. But the conscious organization of such defense is solely up to humans. So how are we going to self-consciously organize this agent of social transformation? How do we get humans to become a political actor? What would that mean? Surprisingly, Malm turns to the critical theorist Theodor Adorno, who, as you can see, is not the most high-energy agent of social transformation. Right. In particular, he turns to Adorno's lecture in 1962 called Progress. Adorno was a critical theorist from Germany. He fled Germany before World War II. He's from his mother's Jewish family. He returns to Germany in 1949. He continues to be concerned about the possibility of the return of fascism in Europe, continues to be concerned also about humanity ending itself, whether that's through nuclear weapons or other tools we've developed that can cause our own extinction. So in reflecting on that, Adorno writes, the forms of humanity's own global societal constitutions threaten its life. If a self-conscious global subject does not develop and intervene, the possibility of progress, of averting the most extreme total disaster, has migrated to this global subject alone. So this is, I think, an important quote that I'm going to return to several times. But before I try to get into interpreting what this might mean, I just want to point out how unlikely it is to turn to Adorno as a source of information about how to transform society. Right? For one thing, of course, Adorno was writing before climate change was widely understood as a threat. But also, if Adorno is known outside of political theory at all, he's usually known as this kind of thumbs down guy, right? He's known as like a very negative person who's very unhopeful and very skeptical about the possibility of political action, right? In fact, he had a very contentious relationship to the student movement in the 60s and was very skeptical about the kinds of actions that Malm himself seems to call for, right? In fact, Adorno even found signing petitions an uncomfortable form of political action. He thought even that was a little bit too much for him, and he said, because in their inevitable desire to have a political impact, they always contain an element of untruth. And in his view, even that was too much. So this is actually a photo from one of the students protesting Adorno's lectures towards the end of his life. And they protested him in part because of what they perceived as this pessimistic attitude about the possibility of political action and social transformation. So, for example, in a 1968 lecture, he said, one clings to action for the sake of the impossibility of action. Right? The only reason to do something is because it's actually impossible and you can't quite accept that. Or in his letter to fellow critical theorist Herbert Marcuse, who had a much closer relationship to the student movement, Adorno wrote, you think that praxis in its emphatic sense is not blocked today. I think differently. Right? So he was just like, yeah, there's nothing to do. On the other hand, I also think that that's an exaggerated portrait. I think it's very clear that Adorno is an unlikely source of guidance here, but I wouldn't suggest that it's impossible to find value here. He also says in the 1964-1965 lectures, where he develops some of the themes from that Progress essay, given the way the world is organized, even the simplest demand for integrity and decency must necessarily lead almost everyone to protest. So it's not an unmixed bag. But let's turn back to this idea of the global subject. Right? So Malm offers this quote at the end of the book. He says, this is the same quote as before, right? That the forms of humanity's own global societal constitutions threaten its life if a self-conscious global subject does not develop and intervene. Having quoted that, Malm ends the book. He says, where is that global subject? Who is it? Merely asking such questions is to weigh up the void in which we fumble. So I'm going to try to pick up where Malm has left off here and try and offer more of an account of who that global subject is and why we might find it useful today. Right. Now, one of the things that's important is that, of course, this global subject doesn't yet exist. And so you might very well wonder, one of the first questions you might ask is, well, if no person, no one individual has it in their power to initiate or constitute a global subject, in what sense could it really be useful for orienting us to climate action today? How can we use this idea of this thing that doesn't exist to help us navigate the world that does? Now, I don't want to suggest that the idea of a global subject can replace the existence of an actual global subject. We would need an actual global subject for our actions to be meaningful in the sense that we want them to be. But I do think that the idea of a global subject can serve as a tool for identifying our interests in a way that helps us resist some of the most destructive and self-destructive forms of politics today. That is to say, part of what the global subject can do for us today is rule out some forms of politics because they're incompatible with the idea of this global subject that eventually we will need to have. Right? So in particular, I think this idea of a global subject helps orient us to developing forms of the transnational political identity that we will need to have in order to address climate change. And it will need to do that in opposition to a rising reactionary nationalism. So we need this idea of a global subject to, for example, say we're in opposition to anti-immigrant politics. If we want to build climate change, if we want to address climate change, we need to build solidarity across borders, or we'll have no hope of doing that. And some things are simply incompatible, right, with that idea of a global subject and that idea of the transnational solidarity that we need to build. So the idea of a global subject can make it possible for us to keep open that space where we can imagine and hopefully realize the solidarity that we need to address the climate crisis. So that's part of how I think it can be useful to us today. So in the last lecture, I talked about the idea that we didn't lack solutions to the climate crisis. We lacked the will to execute them, right? And I think that we see a very similar attitude in Adorno. We don't lack ideas about what to do, right? What we are is in a position where we can't do the things that we need to do. So for Adorno, again, it wasn't climate, but there were other threats to humanity. So Adorno talked about a world where, thanks to the present state of technical forces of production, no one on the planet needs suffer deprivation anymore, yet billions suffer nevertheless. Right? And so whether there will be further want and oppression will be decided solely by the avoidance of catastrophe through the rational establishment of the whole society as humanity. Right? We live in a world where people are facing tremendous suffering unnecessarily. That was true then, that's true now. Right? If we're going to avoid that, we need to work, he says, for the rational establishment of humanity as society. We need to have a self-conscious global subject to address these problems that are generated by truly global structures that could be otherwise. So is humanity now capable of preventing catastrophe? It doesn't feel like it, right? And so I talked in the second lecture about how we feel inexorably compelled forward, right, by the structure of capitalism, by the way that capitalism exerts an abstract form of compulsion, in Moishe Postone's words. Right? If you're a capitalist, you need to keep accumulating capital or you're going to go bankrupt, you're going to lose. Right? If you're not making the most profits, people are going to take their money and put it somewhere else. You don't really have a choice once you're in the system. Same if you're a worker. Right? If you don't keep working, you're not going to get enough food to eat. Right? So we're in a situation where, because of these systemic imperatives, it feels like we can't stop. But especially with respect to climate now, it's clear that we have to stop, or warming is going to make the planet uninhabitable. So The idea of a global subject, I think, helps us imagine what it would take to get out of this system, right? To get out of this system where it feels like we can't stop, right? In our world as individuals, we're not free to exit this system, right? And in fact, instead we have to continually adjust ourselves to the reality of these systemic imperatives. So to cope with that, we've come up with conceptions of freedom that can accommodate this and obscure it, right? We identify our freedom with the economic activities we undertake, right? We identify freedom with freedom in the market, and we conceive of our political freedom and political equality in ways that don't account for how we're constrained by economic power and hierarchy. But human freedom can't be effectively reduced to freedom in the market. Human freedom always also concerns how we live together, and so it necessarily has cooperative and collective dimensions. So in light of that, the only way out for humanity is to recognize that it's collectively capable of changing these systems and deciding to act otherwise, that is, a self-conscious global subject. Right? No actions on the level of individuals or the nation are going to be sufficient, given that these are really systemic imperatives that govern the whole globe. So Adorno doesn't mean, when he's talking about this, something like better international institutions. They can help, but they can also hurt, right? Lots of global international institutions aren't signs of a self-conscious humanity. They're just ways of perpetuating domination and imperialism, right? So you can't simply say we need better institutions, right? In fact, what Adorno says is, I have no need to tell you what I mean by this global subject of mankind is not simply an all-embracing terrestrial organization, but a human race that possesses genuine control of its own destiny right down to the concrete details, and is thus able to fend off the unseeing blows of nature. I think that's a pretty wild quote. Like, that's a crazy thing to say, actually, right? Control of its own destiny right down to the concrete details. If nothing else, that sounds like the kind of claim to popular sovereignty to take back control that I was criticizing in the last lecture. So what's going on here? What's a way of interpreting what Adorno means that doesn't mean that? So I think there's an important claim here that when he says, just as individuals have not existed hitherto, so too there's been no global subject. The two are corollaries of one another. Now this might just sound like another crazier thing to say. He's saying, well, individuals haven't existed yet. But I actually think that's a way of trying to understand what he means here. Why what he's saying isn't the kind of claim to control that I've been criticizing. I think saying individuals have not existed hitherto shows that he's clearly not talking about any kind of familiar conception of freedom, where individuals are taken as sort of self-evident units that are separate from their environment and they're free when they can choose as they please. Right? As I've argued, that conception of freedom, that conception of the individual as having a kind of will that's separate from its environment, ends up in domination, right? Everything becomes subordinated to the individual's efforts to control everything around them in the name of their own freedom. So I think that what Adorno is doing here is actually engaging in a kind of a claim based in the representative logic of difference that I talked about in the previous lecture. It's not a coincidence, I think, that I used this quote from Angela Davis as an exemplar of that. Right? She said it was because, as a black woman, she'd been marked as different, that she could be an especially good representative of the people. And Davis was a student of Adorno's, actually, as well as a student of Marcuse's. And so I think, which is not to say he should take credit for her insights or anything, but I think it's relevant as we think about these traditions of thought. Right? And I think that what Adorno is doing in saying individuals haven't existed yet is he's making a claim that individuals are non-self-identical, that they're not that kind of easily separable unit where they can be independent and dominate their surroundings. In fact, I think he's suggesting, right, that there's a more porous relationship between individuals and their environment. So to say that the global subject and the individual are corollaries of one another, right, is to say that the individual and the global subject can only exist if they both exist at the same time. There's no real individuals without a self-conscious global subject. Right? So he's ruling out the idea of individuals as autarkic, right, as separated from each other, separated from their environment. And he's suggesting how freedom necessarily has this collective dimension. Right? A self-conscious global subject can only exist if the people who make it up are free. The global subject couldn't really be self-conscious, it couldn't engage in self-determination if its component parts were themselves dominated and unfree. And by the same token, an individual can only really be free, he's suggesting, within the context of a self-conscious global subject. Because without a self-conscious global subject, we're locked into these systems of domination. We're locked into systems we haven't chosen, systems that we feel like we can't change. So if individuals really want to be free, he's saying, we need to be in a world with a self-conscious global subject. Now, as an affirmative claim, like to then say, okay, and here's what a global subject looks like, that would be much stronger, right? Again, I've suggested that part of what Adorno is doing is offering this idea as a way of saying, well, with this idea, we can rule some things out as incompatible with freedom. Right, so as Deborah Cook, who's the author of Adorno on Nature, puts it, if we must appeal to humanity to make any progress that's worthy of the name, it's also the case that we do not yet know what humanity is. Right, so again, I'm going to suggest this is a useful way of thinking about this because it says we're going to resist claims, we're going to resist what exists, and we don't necessarily need to make a very strong claim about what's going to follow from that. Right? We can use this to criticize certain features of politics, to rule some kinds of politics out as we try and find new bases of global solidarity. So to do that and help us think about what this idea helps us rule out, I'm actually going to turn to Adorno's co-author and friend, Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer co-authored the book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment with Adorno. That's them there. But Adorno's on the right, Horkheimer's on the left, if you can't tell the difference. You'd be forgiven if you couldn't. And Adorno, so Horkheimer gives this lecture series called Eclipse of Reason in 1944 as these two are co-authoring their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it's in those lectures that I think Horkheimer gives us a very good example of the kind of domination that we face today and why the idea of a global subject helps us think about and resist that. So in this lecture series called Eclipse of Reason, Horkheimer devotes one of the lectures to what he calls the revolt of nature. And I think it's there we can find some real resources for understanding the climate crisis and why the idea of a global subject can be useful to address it. So he calls it the eclipse of reason. What does it mean for reason to be eclipsed? Here's what he says. For the average man, self-preservation has become dependent upon the speed of his reflexes. Reason itself becomes identical with this adjustive faculty. So what does that mean? Well, what he's saying is that reason has always been humanity's foremost tool for self-preservation, right? Reason is the thing that we use in order to adjust to our environment so that we can survive, right? If we're not good at reasoning about our environment, we're not going to make it. And so he says we can go back to primitive humanity. Primitive humans used means and reasoning to survive a natural world that was vastly more powerful than they were. Right? So reason helped them adjust to their environment and survive. But now we live in a world where humanity has, through the use and development of its means and reasoning, developed tools that make us collectively so powerful, our actions now threaten the environment. And because of that, they now threaten our own survival. Yet as individuals, we still need to adjust ourselves to this world and its systemic imperatives. Right? We still need to use our reason to adjust ourselves to the world that we inhabit with this self-destructive system, even as the larger functioning of that system is impairing our freedom and it's not serving our individual or collective interests. So reason has been eclipsed in the sense that this larger system is irrational in this larger sense, but people have lost their sense of reason as anything more than that adjustive faculty, as the way to use their means and reasoning to get around and succeed within the environment as it's given to them. So we've lost that larger sense of how to judge this system as irrational because as individuals, we're committed to trying to adjust ourselves so that we can survive. Now, Horkheimer brings this together in, I think, a very useful way as we think about the climate crisis, because he thinks of the car as the perfect symbol of this. Right? So the car, using fossil fuels, that was not his focus, right, is for Horkheimer the perfect example of how modern civilization both enables our freedom and requires us to adjust to its own terms and requires us to adjust ourselves to its systemic imperatives. So this is sort of a long passage, but let me read it quickly. Quite different degrees of freedom are involved in driving a horse and in driving a modern automobile. Aside from the fact that the automobile is available to a much larger percentage of the population than the carriage was, the automobile is faster and more efficient, requires less care, and is perhaps more manageable. However, the accretion of freedom has brought about a change in the character of freedom. It is as if the innumerable laws, regulations, and directions with which we must comply were driving the car, and not us. There are speed limits, warnings to drive slowly, to stop, to stay within certain lanes, even diagrams showing the shape of the curve ahead. We must keep our eyes on the road and be ready at each instant to react with the right motion. Our spontaneity has been replaced by a frame of mind which compels us to discard every emotion or idea that might impair our alertness to the impersonal demands assailing us. Now, part of why I like this passage is that I think most of us grew up with cars, and I think this has a kind of nice work of estranging ourselves from that experience. It sort of says, what would it be like to think about this if you were just encountering it for the first time? And part of what Horkheimer recognizes about it is that it's freeing in certain respects. It's better than the carriage. But it also requires us to cut ourselves off from part of our human nature. Right? Our involvement with this technology, right, the requirements of moving 2 tons of metal at 100 feet per second, means that we have to subordinate our individuality to the systemic imperatives of the road. Right? We have to repress our spontaneity. We have to cut ourselves off from parts of our humanity to meet these impersonal demands. Now, Horkheimer is not offering this as a kind of Luddite view. He's not smashing cars. But I think it's striking. It's kind of opposite of the sort of veneration of speed that you would see in Italian futurism, for example. So we have to repress our human nature in order to comply with the system, to comport with the system, and to survive. Especially when you're driving a car, you could die, right? And other people could die. So it's important to do this, right? There's good reasons to repress this spontaneity in yourself and conform to the system. But it has costs. Now consider, beyond what Horkheimer did, consider, for example, an Uber driver who has to conform themselves, has to adjust themselves and adjust their human nature, not just to comply with the rules of the road, but to comply with the algorithm that's telling them whether or not they can make any money and get any food for dinner that night. Right? Consider, too, what Horkheimer did and the environmental impact of the fossil fuel use in the car. Right? Even if you were to eliminate some of these things, right, consider the sort of techno-utopian aspiration for self-driving cars rather than, for example, affordable, accessible, clean public transportation. Right, so I think the car works very well as a symbol of the kind of adjustment that Horkheimer worries about. Right? And he worries because there's a real cost to repressing our own spontaneous nature here. So Horkheimer says this. He says, domination of nature involves domination of man. Each subject not only has to take part in the subjugation of external nature, human and non-human, but in order to do so must subjugate nature in himself. Domination becomes internalized for domination's sake. So part of what Horkheimer is arguing here is that humans first adjusted themselves to nature for the sake of survival, right? But now we have to adjust ourselves to the demands of the systems that we created to survive nature. Right? We created those systems for the sake of surviving nature, but now they've metastasized way beyond those needs. Right? They've now become systems of domination. But it's hard to change course. Right? We're locked into these systems that make car use a part of everyday life. And we've internalized that domination. We've become habituated to cutting ourselves off to our own spontaneity, and we become habituated to adjusting ourselves to the imperatives of the system, even as the point of the system has changed from survival to self-destruction. Unsurprisingly, this experience of constantly adjusting ourselves to a self-destructive world is exhausting and infuriating. So he says, the necessity of adjustment, of course, existed also in the past. The difference lies in the tempo of compliance, in the degree to which this attitude has permeated the whole being of the people and altered the nature of the freedom gained. Above all, it lies in the fact that modern humanity surrenders to this process not like a child who has a natural confidence in authority, but like an adult who gives up the individuality he's acquired. The victory of civilization is too complete to be true. Therefore, adjustment in our times involves an element of resentment and suppressed fury. People are angry about the adjustments they have to make. People understand that they're giving something up in order to adjust to these systems. Right? And so I think one of the ways you can think about this is as a form of generating political road rage. Right? So think about, as the demands of the market have become more intense, right, people have more and more responsibility for surviving thrust upon them as social safety nets are cut. More and more of life is subordinated to market imperatives, and more things, right, become part of the market. Well, think about what happens with cars, right? If somebody identifies their freedom with driving, if they're used to subordinating their human spontaneity to the demands of the vehicle, we'll predictably see explosions of road rage when gridlock or other obstacles make them feel like their freedom in driving is blocked. And so I think part of what we can understand today as we think about global politics is as this kind of explosion of political road rage. Right? Reactionary authoritarian leaders around the world, right, are growing in power and popularity, fueled by anger at the system, right? Fueled by people's anger that they have to adjust. Right? Ordinary people resent these constant adjustments to the demands of the system, but importantly, they often direct their resentment at those who are even more dominated by the system than they are. They do not direct their resentment up, they direct it down. And so one of the things that we'll need to think about is why? Right? Why is this such a major obstacle to transnational solidarity? So to understand that, right, we need to understand part of why people are so much, as it were, less well-adjusted these days. Right? For a long time, neoliberalism was a very popular politics. Right? People now often complain about neoliberalism, but in the US, for example, politicians like Bill Clinton were very popular for proposing neoliberal solutions to things. Neoliberalism helped, it provided ordinary people with an intelligible theory that could make identifying with market forces seem like common sense. Right? People like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek had bestsellers, right, explaining why people should identify with their power as consumers rather than with their weakness as workers. Right? A fundamental claim here, I think, is that people would rather see themselves as powerful than as weak. And for a long time, neoliberal discourse offered people a way to do that. Right? It offered ordinary people a range of ways of seeing themselves as exercising freedom and agency in alignment with system imperatives. Right? They could be risk-taking entrepreneurs looking boldly to the future. They could be prudent managers of their own human capital. They could be discerning consumers exercising their freedom of choice. Those were all stories we could tell about why the way we adjusted ourselves was okay. Right? Why we could live with it. But the story doesn't work anymore. Not as well as it did. Right? Neoliberalism promised a common interest in competition. Right, that even losers could be winners in the long run. But as neoliberalism has declined in efficacy as a means of identifying with these system forces, it's been replaced with more open appeals to identify with the domination of others. Right? It's not a world where even losers get to be winners in the long run. As this legitimating discourse has declined, it's more a world in which it's very important that there are losers and I'm not one of them. So, for example, this is again not just a US issue. Last year, the Alternative for Deutschland party became the first far-right party to win a state election in Germany since World War II. And not coincidentally, from the perspective of climate issues, right, in a region in East Germany where the economy used to rely heavily on coal mining. Right. Now, support for this party doesn't come from those who are worst off economically. And that's true of many of these authoritarian reactionary parties, right? writing about this in the New York Times, a reporter quoted a local resident, people here don't have it bad, but they're frustrated and they're looking for a release, right? And that release is directed at those over whom they feel they can and should dominate, rather than at those who dominate them. So why does that happen? Why do people vent their anger at those below them rather than those above them? I think Horkheimer has a good answer here. Right? If no fundamental change in the system is imaginable, well then dominated people are going to respond by identifying themselves with the forces of domination and dominate others in turn. Better to imagine you're part of the system than to be the one who's crushed beneath it. Or as he puts it, if there is no other norm than the status quo, if all the hope of happiness that reason can offer is that it preserves the existing as it is and even increases its pressure, the mimetic impulse is never really overcome. Men revert to it in a regressive and distorted form. That is to say, they just imitate the people who are dominating them. So this was just a couple days ago. I was quite struck by this as we think about the intensifying pressures of dehumanization. This is the head of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau in the United States. ICE director envisions Amazon-like mass deportation system. Prime but with human beings. Right? That's the kind of dehumanization that the system produces. Now, it only produces this after a long time, right? This becomes a crisis, but when it becomes a crisis, it's drawing on decades of habits that people have developed, right? Decades of emotional habits, habits of mind. So, and those everyday habitual emotions help pave the way for the violence that happens during crises like this. Right? So in his book, Disaster Nationalism, Richard Seymour catalogs some of these things. Right? The authoritarian need to be right, the capacity to humiliate, approval seeking in-group conformity, converse tendencies towards malice and social sadism. Right? As he puts it, these are the ordinary micro-fascisms. And they stay micro for a long time until they build up and then they become something else. And to connect this to the second lecture, I do think that what I've called, or what Guy Debord calls, the society of the spectacle intensifies this, right? This idea that we're permanently spectators, that our main way of being involved in politics is as kind of spectators of what's going on, intensifies this feeling for everybody that real power is being exercised elsewhere. So the French theorist Michel de Certeau, in his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, observes something similar. He says, marginality is today no longer limited to minority groups, but is rather massive and pervasive. This cultural activity of the non-producers of culture remains the only one possible for all those who nevertheless buy and pay for the showy products through which a productivist economy articulates itself. Marginality is becoming universal. A marginal group has now become a silent majority. So one effect of the society we live in is that because there's these system imperatives and because people experience politics as a spectacle, everybody feels like someone else has power. Everybody feels that they're marginalized in some way, and everybody feels justified in directing their rage at others. So really crucially, what these authoritarian leaders can do, right, is they can help direct that resentment in ways that help perpetuate the system. So part of how this happens is that the openness of the appeal to dominate can seem like a violation of the system's norms of appearance, right? So in an ordinary liberal democracy, you're not supposed to dominate other people. We're all supposed to be equal in some kind of way. And so when someone like Trump says, oh no, we all know, right, that some people are real, like, pond scum, that seems like a violation, right? That seems like something you're not supposed to do. And so it seems like, oh, that's a really free person. He broke the rules. Right? Or as Adorno puts it, as Horkheimer puts it, modern demagogues usually behave like unruly boys who normally are reprimanded or oppressed by their parents, teachers, or some other civilizing agency. Their effect on an audience seems due partly to the fact that by acting out repressed urges, they seem to be flying in the face of civilization and sponsoring the revolt of nature. But never forget the purpose of their clowning. Their constant aim is to tempt nature to join the forces of repression by which nature itself is to be crushed. In other words, all that excitement that people get from seeing someone try to break the rules, that excitement gets directed in ways that perpetuate the system, right? It gets directed, it feels like a rebellion, but it's a rebellion to preserve the social order. It's a way of directing that anger and emotion in a way that keeps things locked in place. So I think this is connected to the claim that I was making in my previous lecture, right, about these representative claims of homogeneity. There's ways that the people can claim power that make it natural to attack those who are marked as different. Right? So when equality is understood to be based on similarity, then being different means either it's natural to dominate you or it's natural to be dominated by you. And we know which one people would rather have, right? So if you understand equality to be based in similarity, you want to pull down the people who are above you, but more importantly, you want to make sure there's someone who's permanently below you, right? And that was the logic that I identified Tocqueville seeing in his visit to America, where he understood white supremacy as an aristocracy founded on visible and imperishable signs. Because people were marked as different, they could be a kind of permanent underclass to soothe the feeling that white people had about dealing with these system imperatives. And I think this is important today for understanding the centrality of anti-immigrant sentiment in global politics right now. Right? Where can worker anger be directed without making any real changes in property relations? Well, if you direct your anger at immigrants as the cause of low wages, then capitalists can pose as pro-worker, so long as they keep that category of worker divided. So by keeping us divided and seeing our interests as opposed, anti-immigrant sentiment poses a crucial obstacle to transnational solidarity, and that transnational solidarity is necessary to address the climate crisis. And I think it's especially important that the climate movement think about anti-immigrant sentiment, because there's a history of the environmental movement being sympathetic to anti-immigrant sentiment. So environmental scientists, environmental thinkers like Garrett Hardin were famous for having the idea that blocking immigration would be good for the environment. So I think there's a special challenge for some environmental movements to make it explicit that they see this anti-immigrant sentiment as a danger to transnational solidarity. Now, it makes sense, of course, that there would be this, that people would identify this as a threat, right? We live in a global economy that is characterized by a kind of racial capitalism, right? Labor markets are segmented by national, gender, and racial divisions, and those divisions then get naturalized, right, in order to justify that segmentation. So it can come to seem natural that some workers come cheaper than others, and those workers can then be used to undercut the wages of the rest of the workers. So these national and racial divisions, gender divisions, can be mobilized to prevent worker organizing and to keep workers individualized. It's a way of uniting them under a collective identity without actually uniting them as a collective agent, right? It's a way of bringing them together by sharing an identity without making it possible for them to actually make any decisions together. So I could say more about some of the way that this works. I'm not going to belabor this point. But I do want to add that I think this is very importantly connected to gender as well, right? Because if gender and racial and national hierarchies are natural, well then domination is natural, right? Domination of both people and the planet. But because we're actually interdependent, right, that struggle to appear self-sufficient, the struggle to appear like it's natural for you to be in charge and you're not relying on other people, well, that requires constant violent maintenance and propaganda. So you can see here the idea, right, that this is just a couple clips from Fox News this week, defending Trump's tariffs because the idea is it will make the United States autarkic, it will make the United States self-sufficient, right? And you can see it's immediately associated with the idea of being a male head of household, right? It's immediately gendered in this. And you can see the way in which then these ideas, the idea of a global subject, connects us in a way that's directly contrary to these efforts to divide us and to put us into a hierarchy, right? The idea of a global subject resists this kind of segmentation and division. You can see here, this is another thing from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. If it crosses the US border illegally, it's our job to stop it. People, money, products, ideas. And I think this suggests the significance of ideas like the global subject, right? It is a way of reorienting us. And it's quite significant, I think, when we connect these ideas of independence to fossil fuels as well. So Kara Daggett, in her article on petromasculinity, observes fossil fuels also secure cultural meaning and political subjectivities. Fossil fuels have become potent conservative symbols that represent autonomy and self-sufficiency rather than real economic interests for most of the public. So again, you can see here in this picture, Trump digs coal with these white guy coal miners. Part of the idea is all of this symbolizes the idea that individuals can be free under the current order. They can be independent. They can know that because they can dominate other people, right? Fossil fuel helps symbolize this. And it's clearly connected to race and gender in these ways. Right? These are all ways of naturalizing the idea that some people should be in charge. So I think it's not a surprise that a lot of these movements have spent decades now demonizing concern for the environment as an intolerable acknowledgement of human interdependence and as a kind of Trojan horse for socialism. So on the right, you have a Wall Street Journal op-ed from 1991. As the Soviet Union's falling apart, as communism exits history's stage, the main threat to liberty may come from a utopian environmental movement that, like socialism, views the welfare of human beings as subordinate to higher values. Or here on the left, an interview from 1992 with Milton Friedman, who says, what was the supposedly right-wing president, Mr. Bush, doing? It was the first Bush. Presiding over enormous increases in paternalism, the Clean Air Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Right? So clearly ways in which these acknowledgements of human interdependence, both on each other and on the environment, are threatening to the ways of normalizing the system and legitimating its imperatives. So I'm going to skip this for now, except to say briefly, right, I'm reluctant to engage in this kind of psychoanalyzing of people, right? It seems, compared to like a hard economic analysis of their material self-interests, it seems both potentially condescending in the way that it interprets people. It seems irrational. But I think we're really in a world where it's very hard to use rationalism to explain people's actions. If rationalism could explain people's actions, this problem would have been dealt with a long time ago. Right? But this is just, I think from yesterday, the Trump administration is seeking to completely end all federally funded climate research. Right? Not trying to solve the problem, but just simply trying to pretend it doesn't exist. So let me come back to the global subject in this context of the efforts to divide and segment people, to direct people's anger at immigrants and other vulnerable groups as a way to keep the system going. I think a world in which immigrants are demonized is not a world in which people will come together across national borders to address the global threat of climate change. Right? Our social world is not organized as though climate change presents a real threat to human survival. Right? Major political and economic institutions are simply not taking the kind of measures that reflect the reality of the challenge we face. But they are organized to violently enforce borders. Right? So in that context, right, individual actions to mitigate emissions aren't going to seem meaningful. Right? They're not having the same kind of effect. But openly avowing pride and domination, right, refusing to act in environmentally conscious ways seems coherent. It actually better fits the institutions that we have, right? It seems more responsive to reality rather than less. And so I think that's where the idea of a global subject really importantly intervenes, right? The idea of a global subject can be politically efficacious today as a way of resisting these attempts to divide us and of holding space where solidarity can be possible, right? Creating the idea, contrary to the reality of the institutions that we have, that our actions to address climate could be meaningful. So let me go back to the analogy with road rage, right? How has the United States dealt with road rage? Well, it's just given into it, right? We have much larger vehicles, many more pedestrian deaths, and much less like fuel economy, right? And so similarly, we've seen political capitulation to the politics of anti-immigrant fear-mongering, right? Major parties throughout the world have campaigned on border toughness to avoid being outflanked by the radical right. Now, a real solution to road rage would not be to give in to it and to let people drive bigger cars and hurt people with them, but to change our actual physical infrastructure so that driving a huge car no longer seemed like one of the more satisfying ways of experiencing freedom that's available to ordinary people. Right? And I think that the idea of a global subject offers something similar with respect to climate. Right? As Deborah Cook puts it, radical change that benefits both human and non-human nature requires that we strike a blow for freedom. We must break out of the prison of survival imperatives. And I think that the idea of a global subject provides a way for people to identify shared interests and to act in solidarity with each other. So that's my case for the global subject. Now let me very briefly consider the problem in the title of the lecture, right, which is this idea of the global as homogenizing, because this is also one that's raised importantly in the context of climate change. I think it's an important challenge to my proposal that we take this idea of a global subject seriously. And so Eric Swingadow says, the claim that climate change concerns us all cuts across the idiosyncrasies of different heterogeneously constituted, differently acting, often antagonistic human and non-human nature. This universalizing claim of the pending catastrophe is socially homogenizing. I think it's a very straightforward claim. You're just saying, we're evacuating all the differences between people. If climate change is going to wipe us all out, none of the other stuff really matters. And so we don't need to pay attention to it, right? And I think specifically with respect to indigeneity, there's reason to be concerned about that. So again, I go back to Andreas Malm, who I think is, I'm only criticizing here because I think he's such an important thinker and figure in the climate movement. Right? In How to Blow Up a Pipeline, he writes about some of the more minor acts of sabotage that he engaged in deflating the tires of sport utility vehicles in Stockholm. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that these acts were claimed by a group called, quote, the Indians of the Concrete Jungle. And Malm boasts that following their success, copycat groups of Indians, or tribes, as they would call themselves, appeared. So in engaging in these actions, Malm is adopting a kind of indigenous identity, which he acknowledges was, quote unquote, silly, potentially even inappropriate. He says, parenthetically, we received an email from a Native American upset about our cultural appropriation. But aside from this parentheses, he doesn't really interrogate in this book his desire for this kind of identification and substitution for the place of indigenous politics. So given what an important figure Malm is, I think if indigenous people were concerned about the global homogenizing and erasing their politics, they might be concerned. Now, if we take Adorno at his word, there's a way of addressing this. Now, it's not obvious, of course, that Adorno is the person we need to take as the authority here, but I want to suggest how he might respond before turning to some indigenous responses. Again, I think Adorno is a very negative figure. He's the thumbs down guy, right? And so his view of solidarity is not premised on any kind of view of a homogeneous unity, but an idea of solidarity against the domination we face. He says the spirit of solidarity is only able to develop on the back of the spirit of repression, which that of solidarity then annuls. So we've developed, whether we like it or not, we've developed a global economic order that's destroying the planet. And the only way to get out of it is to change the global economic order. That's going to require a global level solution, right? So we need global solidarity, we need transnational solidarity, not because of anything affirmative about humanity, but basically because of something negative about the bad thing that we've done, right? So it's because we've engaged in this domination that we need solidarity to oppose it. Right, so I think Adorno, from Adorno's perspective, he clearly embraces what I've called a politics of refusal, a politics of difference that does make space for heterogeneity. But it would be weird to ask this question and give him the final word. So I want to consider some of the indigenous politics at stake here, some of the ways that indigenous theorists have thought about a global subject. And so I want to turn back to Leanne Simpson and her conception of what she calls Nishnabek internationalism. So the Nishnabek have a story about Nanabush, who's a figure who explores the world. So she writes, Nanabush walked the world to understand their place in it, our place in it, to create face-to-face relationships with other nations and beings, because Nanabush understood that the Nishnabek, that we all are linked to all of creation in a global community. Nanabush's footprints marked all over the Canadian Shield remind us of their internationalism and that the global interconnections of our local place-based existences are intimately intertwined. So there's no hesitance about invoking the idea of the global here, but there is an important, I think, addition, which is this idea of place-based, local place-based existences. So one of the things that we can draw from Simpson's work is this idea of land as a way of refusing that logic of equivalence, that logic that does homogenize, that logic that does lead to this anxiety of equality that leads to domination. So Simpson argues capitalism cannot exist within grounded normativity. That is, the way that we ought to act is governed by the land, and the land is simply different in other places. Right? In contrast, under capitalism, which he calls the extraction-assimilation system, the act of extraction removes all of the relationships that give whatever is extracted meaning. So it's capitalism that's engaging in the homogeneity, the treatment of land as being interchangeable and fungible. And in her view, the Anishinaabe approach, right, resists that logic of equivalence. It rejects the fungibility. Just as it's unthinkable within an Anishinaabe worldview for a leader to impose their will on their people, it's unthinkable to impose an agenda onto another living thing. In essence, the context is the curriculum, and land, aki, is the context. So this is a way of engaging with the land that is not about dominating it, that's not about turning it all into the same or turning it into a resource that can be sold. It's a way of saying that a global subject would actually be grounded in a recognition of this place-based differences that there are, right, that are intertwined. Now, I think there's methodological questions here. I'm not an indigenous person, and I'm quoting from Simpson's work, but I think there's questions about whether this way of doing so is actually compatible with solidarity. So I want to turn to what she says about solidarity in a way of closing. She says, I think my Anishinaabe ethical practices demonstrate that I must develop relationships of reciprocity and co-resistance with these communities that embody our ethical practices of solidarity. I cannot just take their theories. Right? And so she says she has some questions that she wants to ask about using theories from other traditions. She says, I think grounded normativity in its Anishinaabemowin formation compels us to ask particular questions when we're engaging with theories from outside our own practices. Where does this theory come from? Who generated it? What was their relationship to community and the dominant power structures? What's my relationship to the theorist? Can I use it in an ethical and appropriate way, my ethics and theirs, given the colonial context within which scholarship and publishing take place? So I think if I'm going to address this question, right, will the global subject erase indigenous politics, I need to take seriously Simpson's admonition that I cannot just take their theories. Right? I don't want to make an inappropriate representational claim in offering an answer to the question posed by the lecture title. Right? I want to make sure that in offering this lecture, I'm in a relationship of solidarity. Because if the idea of a global subject is offered with the aim of building solidarity, then these questions are relevant. Right? They're not just a checklist, like a bunch of things to tick off, but if the idea of offering a global subject is to be in solidarity with other people, right, to build a global subject to address the climate crisis, well then I need to be in solidarity with indigenous leaders of the climate struggle in order to help constitute a global subject. So there would be a kind of contradiction if I offered, in that sense, a definitive answer here, one that claimed that I could be the authority to this question about whether or not indigenous politics are erased. I think the answer to that question isn't one that depends just on what I say here today, but it depends on the larger relationships that this lecture is a part of, right? Will we use these ideas to advance common interests, right? If we do, then I would hope that would mean that, by definition, that would mean not erasing these indigenous politics. But that's, in a certain sense, up to us. It's not something that can be determined in advance. So I want to pursue these themes further in the next lecture, which I just want to, in this sense, offer a brief preview for. because I think that some of these indigenous ideas about land are extremely important to the next lecture on the market. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, in her book Breeding Sweetgrass, talks about how we need to transform the idea of the market. And I think that it's quite striking. She says, each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relation, right? We need to be grateful for the things that we receive. And so she herself turns to another indigenous tradition, the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, which is offered at the beginning of ceremonies, beginning of big gatherings, to sort of catalog all the things one's thankful for. She says, you can't listen to the Thanksgiving Address without feeling wealthy. And while expressing gratitude seems innocent enough, it's a revolutionary idea. In a consumer society, contentment is a radical proposition. Recognizing abundance rather than scarcity undermines an economy that thrives on creating unmet desires. So in that spirit of solidarity I've tried to explain today, I'm going to pursue some of these ideas in that final lecture, the next lecture, not the final one. Does addressing climate change require us to shift our understanding of the market? So I'll leave it there for now. If you folks have any questions.
All right, we have time for questions and a whole lot to think about.
Two points, one a helpful comment, one a more of a criticism, okay? So the helpful comment, when you were talking about psychoanalyzing people like Trump and the appeal that they have, I was watching a series of videos online to do with the tariff crisis, and I watched a very learned and insightful one from Paul Krugman and another one from Joseph Stiglitz, and I thought they were both very good and helpful. But actually I thought the most insightful comment came from one of the scriptwriters from Jimmy Kimmel Live. So what happened was they quoted Trump saying, look, all these people are lining up to kiss my ass. They're all saying to me, oh, sir, what can we do? What can we do to appease you, right? And the scriptwriter's comment, I mean, Kimmel voiced it, of course, was, yeah, that doesn't sound so much like a dialogue between world leaders. It's more like the kind of pornography you like to watch. And I thought, actually, yes, actually it was. It was a really insightful comment. So that was helpful because in a way it reinforces the things you were saying. My more critical question is, look, in your appropriation of all this Frankfurt School stuff, I'm really suspicious of it because it seems like a fundamental denial of the Humean idea that reason is a slave of the passions. They think reason can itself deliver moral truths, and I think that's just a terrible mistake. It's just not true. Now, could you reconstruct what you say, appropriating some of this stuff without, as it were, going for, I think, this fundamentally mistaken rationalism that characterizes the Frankfurt School?
So I think I have two answers. One is, I think, an interpretive one, which is I would sort of contest that interpretation of their thought, that I think part of their point is that the kind of rationalism you're describing is a tradition of the Enlightenment that is destroying itself, and that if the humanity is going to survive, it needs to move beyond that way of thinking about the role of reason. So I think they would resist the idea that reason is the slave of the passions, because I think simply to put it that way, right, is to suggest that there's an amount of unfreedom there, right, that there's a way in which we're unable we are dominated by our passions. And I think that for them to accept that way of describing us would be to say we really aren't free. So I think you're right that there's an element of rationalism, but that is to say I think they would want to resist simply saying that we are in that way stuck the way we are. But I think they would also say that no one individual has a kind of monopoly on reason in that way, that we need reason in this kind of larger sense of guiding human endeavors, not the claim that, well, people can use their reason to overcome their own desires. Part of why they want to incorporate Freud into their view, is to take account of the way that the passions move us.
All right, question? At the back, at the middle, at the side.
No one else. Okay. So I'm kind of thinking, coincidentally, I was reading a biography of Ho Chi Minh. And it got me thinking that, here is a subject, an individual who was, a Comintern agent. He was backed by a large international movement that gave him the resources, 25 years of exile away from Vietnam, to kind of come back into the country and, start and succeed with a national independence movement, a revolution. So I guess my question is, okay, so we have this subject, or this idea of the subject. What are the various international institutions, the cauldrons within which this kind of agency is going to be formed? Because it doesn't seem like we have that kind of Comintern equivalent for all its faults. We don't really have that same kind of agent out there developing these individuals and these mass movements. So I wonder if that's something that you've thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very important, and to some extent, I'll come back to it in the last lecture, but that's not a very satisfying answer. So let me just say a little bit, because I do think that you're absolutely right that in many respects we're in a worse situation than we were 100-odd years ago, because there are so many fewer institutions to support transnational political organizing. So I think in a lot of ways this is work that's going to need to be done from the ground up. And that's part of why I've framed part of the function of the global subject as negative, saying people do face choices. I think you see this in sort of left parties all the time. Do we embrace an anti-immigrant politics, or do we resist it? And my suggestion is, here's something that the concept of a global subject can say, which is that we absolutely have to reject any kind of compromise with anti-immigrant sentiment, because it's simply not going to be compatible with actually addressing the climate crisis. So can it tell us how to address the climate crisis? Not exactly, but there are some things I think at the very least it can help us rule out.
Thanks. Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering why, say, some of our global billionaires couldn't be the global subject that you're talking about. So I haven't fully understood the nature of the global subject, but it just struck me that, and forgive me for mentioning his name, but someone like Elon Musk, in his work with developing the electric car and leading to that the cost reduction on lithium-ion batteries, effectively was an individual who took on something that couldn't have happened otherwise. It wouldn't have happened through institutions or through governments, but by sort of the dint of one individual's passion. And I'm wondering whether that cannot be, why can't that be applied to solutions for climate change?
I mean, so I guess I would say two things. One, I'm not sure that that's the right way to tell the story of Tesla. But two, even if it were, look at what's happened, look at what Musk has done and the way in which it's been very clear that although it looks like his views had overlapped with a way of addressing the climate crisis, it's now become clear that actually the ideas that have passionately moved him are not about addressing the climate crisis, but as he puts it, he said that it's going to turn out that humanity is just a kind of way of soft booting artificial intelligence. But he's decided that he's wanted to transcend all of this planet, both to leave the planet and go to Mars, and to leave physical humanity by developing machine intelligence. And so I do think that there are ways in which some of these things look like they overlapped with trying to solve sustainable energy problems. But I think as we've seen, that was, in a certain sense, a coincidence, that was not any kind of principled commitment to this. And indeed, I think that, although it's possible, right, I think every successful movement needs a few class traitors, so I wouldn't, it's not like impossible. But I think overwhelmingly, right, trying to count on any one person to do that kind of thing is just not going to work out, particularly given the way in which, I think that the ideas that are moving people right now are radically, they're radically anti-democratic, and so to that extent, they're going to be incompatible with anything like a global subject in which free people would be participating.
Why did you leave out nuclear power and its implications, sir?
Well, I'll address some of the actual, as it were, market costs of generating green energy in the next talk, which is about sort of the market. But I think part of what I'm trying to figure out here is I think that there's a range of policy solutions that could be used to reduce emissions. And I think that for me, the interesting problem is not what's the right policy mix, but why we simply lack the political will to implement any of those policy sets. And so to me, I think there's really important questions to be had about what's the right set of policies to try and address this. But I'm trying to focus on this, as it were, prior question, which is just, well, whatever the right policy is, we don't seem to have the political will to implement any of them, anything that's even in the ballpark. And so, as long as you're playing a sport, there can be strategic questions, but first we need to get into the stadium in that sense.
Jason, yours.
Oh, thanks a lot for that. Fascinating. So I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Elon Musk said the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Sort of meshes, obviously, in with a lot of what you're mentioning here. And I've been noticing also there's a rise in the right on talk of toxic empathy. You have to empathize with the right people and only the right people. And so I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but maybe just if you have thoughts on is maybe on the role of empathy in movement towards this global subject, and maybe also, too, is the attack on empathy, is that sort of fundamental to the more reactionary side, or is it just sort of an immediate sort of reaction, a tool as they sort of recognize that this is a possible weakness for them?
So I think part of it is intrinsic, right? I think that it is a project based in domination, and ultimately empathy for the wrong people is going to be contrary to that project. And I think that Elon Musk quote's very striking, but there's also a very similar quote actually from J.D. Vance trying to kind of normalize specifically this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment, because he was challenged on this, and so he appealed to his faith. He said, there is a Christian concept that you love your family, and that you love your neighbor, and that you love your community, and that you love your fellow citizens. Then after all that, you prioritize the rest of the world, right? So it's specifically trying to provide a kind of theological justification to make his religion compatible with this anti-immigrant sentiment, which led to him getting kind of rebuked by the Pope. And so, but I don't think it's coincidence that he had to, as it were, go there, right? This idea of being against immigration is, I think, really foundational to the idea of keeping the system as it is, because people are frustrated, right? We do live in a world of widening inequality and of declining profits, and so someone needs to be the scapegoat for that, right? If it can't be the system, it needs to be somebody else. And so it's not a coincidence that anti-immigrant sentiment is playing this role, and that you get these really incredible kind of convoluted arguments, which I didn't bother presenting here, but J.D. Vance is arguing that border controls, right, specifically he calls for a critique of the free movement of labor. So he says people having the right to move around violates workers' rights. Right? That's the argument. And so he says it's not just that this decimates the bargaining power of workers, it's also a tech-forward argument. If you can't constantly do the same things with cheaper and cheaper labor, your economy is forced to innovate. Right? So he's trying to gin up an argument that says keeping immigrants out is going to be good for the economy because it'll force innovation. And I think one of the things that's striking about that claim is that it just very straightforwardly says, like, the system imperatives are more important than human need, right? Innovation, quote unquote, is more important than, like, these desperately poor people who just want jobs. And so, you know, if you're going to state it plainly, then you need to sort of say, like, yeah, empathy is toxic, or God says you don't have to love your neighbor, or, you know, whatever.
As a counterpoint to what we're seeing with anti-immigration policies, do you think actively pro-immigration policies are a step towards achieving positive climate cooperation?
So I think that's a great question, and it would depend in part on how the movement proceeded, right? I think part of, like, in the United States, for example, Bernie Sanders in 2016 was sort of campaigning against open borders. He said open borders were a libertarian proposal, and so he was against them in a way that was not entirely dissimilar here. And so I think is the movement for open borders going to be good for climate? It's going to depend in a certain sense who brings it about. Right? If it's brought about by the Koch brothers who are going to, like, legalize the workers that they want, or even illegalize them, but just make it easy for them to come in and then have them be easy to exploit because they're there against the rules, right? Those are not going to be ways that, like, are going to be helpful to the climate movement. But if you have a climate movement that's really saying, like, look, the seas are rising, people need to move or they're going to die, like, we need to accommodate them, like, this is also, whether that's because it's a product of our own emissions or simply out of empathy, right? Those are going to be ways in which opening the borders is part of a climate solution, I think. And otherwise, we're going to live in a world in which climate refugees are trying to move, and the enforcement of borders is only going to get more violent. And that's not going to be a world that that's not going to be a world in which good things are going to happen.
Oh, great. The last question is for me. So pretty frequently, climate theorists, environmental theorists will follow some of this logic, and they'll conclude what we need to cultivate is humility. We have to stop trying to think of ourselves as autarkic, powerful individuals. We need to recognize our interdependence. And it struck me listening to your talk tonight that reading that as humility is actually just utterly, you're in the discourse that is giving us all the problems. Does that make any sense? It seems like reading interdependence as humility is a mistake. I want this lady to feel empowered by her interdependence, and if we could get that, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I find that picture very disturbing. The mass deportation now sign. But I agree with you that I think for someone like Leanne Simpson, the idea of having the appropriate relationship with land is not necessarily a relation of humility. That can be an experience of power. It's an experience of freedom. And I think you're right that to identify it as a kind of humility is, in that sense, to let the forces of domination get to define what power is. And we don't need to do that. We can define power in different ways and make people feel powerful for doing these other things.
Please join me in thanking Ben and join me at the back.